Thank you, Kim. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to see everybody. Wow, hundreds of people online and in person. Doesn't this feel great after a couple of years? I mean, several of us have been waiting to get back in person for a lot of these events. It's great to now see people face to face, have in-depth conversations, not worry about whether the dog's barking, the vacuum's running, a kid running up into you, right? We've all enjoyed those experiences, but wow, it's great to be back in person, and it's a pleasure to see everybody. Thanks for sticking around for my session over lunch. Our agenda today, I won't spend too much time on an intro. Kim, thank you for the wonderful intro. We'll dive into our current situation that's going to set the stage for our wonderful journey over rainbows, groundhogs. How do you jump over that rainbow to a better world in information security? Some closing thoughts. I will do my best to have some time set aside for some Q&A at the end. If for some reason we're not able to cover all the questions, I'll be sticking around for the remainder of the day. So as Kim mentioned, I've been doing this security thing 16, 17 years, and in the last few years, my calling has really been to help lead, coach, mentor, advise teams, organizations, both formally and consulting on the side, and trying to mentor, grow, and give back to the community, which brings me here today. So I'm excited that I can share some of my thoughts and experiences with you on how I've tried to transform and implement solid risk management frameworks in security teams and programs across different verticals. So our current situation, we've had a lot of fascinating technology discussions today, right? We have a lot of very capable, very smart people in the room today, a lot of fantastic vendors that have solutions, but I describe our current situation as this, right? We've been trying to move our cart forward. We've been pressing forward very hard, very intently, trying to secure our entire attack surface. Anytime a new suggestion or idea comes up, sometimes we are too head down. We know what we're doing. We can't be stopped to reevaluate, come up for air. We're going to press forward, and sometimes that induces insanity. Primarily because information security is fundamentally hard, right? I don't think anybody in here would disagree, and the reason is we're trying to battle a threat that is unconstrained. What does that mean, right? The threat can't generally be quantified to an exact degree, so no system can really be threat-proof, right? And so we've gotten to this cycle of trying to secure the entire thing. Very, very similar to putting a fence around a property. You can't secure a property by putting a fence around three sides, but generally you can't see the entire property, right? That's very similar to what we're trying to do in information security. So we found ourselves in this world, this weird insanity conundrum, trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. Anyway, we layer and layer and layer. We layer new solutions. We think a new technology is going to solve our problem, instead of focusing on the underlying business processes and fixing those underlying issues and having very difficult and hard discussions. Some of these that we'll talk about later on are like defining and developing and protecting what we call a protect surface, not an attack surface. And we'll get to that here in a little bit later. Privacy has also made this challenge worse, right, globally. You couple this with the unique challenge and stressors that we're all facing right now, the great resignation, as so it's been called. So we're battling resources, both people, process, technology, and organizations. Not enough individuals working in what we call ComperSec roles, or this combination of compliance, privacy, and security. I think most of us in this room at some point or another have operated in a ComperSec role where you're trying to fill multiple hats at once and you have to go 10 miles wide, 10 miles deep. But it doesn't have to be this way. To claw our way out of it, we're going to dive into a history lesson where some things might have went wrong. We actually knew the answer to this 50 years ago or more. We're going to recap how we can solve this problem. And we're going to start by going on a journey looking for trust. Where art thou trust? And it all starts by looking back at rainbows, right? Maybe not this rainbow. So we're going to hop into our trusty time machine, and we're going to wind up with these rainbows. Does this look familiar to anybody? Bring up some PTSD maybe? So I refer to these as the OG, right? It's the Rainbow series, sometimes known as the Rainbow books. All it is was a series of computer security standards and guidelines that the US government published in the 80s and 90s. originally within the Department of Defense, Computer Security Center, and then by the National Computer Security Center. These standards describe a process of evaluation for trusted systems. In some cases, government entities and private firms would require formal validation of their technology using this process as part of their procurement criteria. You know, many of these standards have influenced and then been superseded by things such as the Common Criteria, but they were called the Rainbow Series because they each had nicknames based on the color of their cover, right? So for example, one of the ones that we'll dive into some examples of how we can draw on the past to solve the challenges of the future is the Orange Book, which dived into discussions for the Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria. Again, you're going to hear the word trust a lot in this conversation because that's fundamentally my hypothesis of where things have went wrong. Over the course of time, we focused on security when we should be focusing on trust. So there's a lot of information up here, but we're going to hone in on a couple of specific areas, right? The Orange Book had 6 fundamental areas, right? Your security policy, marking, identification, accountability assurance, and continuous protection. So what does that mean, right? It means that our policies have to be well-defined and that we determine whether a subject matter can be permitted to gain access to a specific object. It sounds incredibly simple, right? Then you have your labels, your tagging tied to the sensitivity of a document in which access to the information is mediated based on the identity and what information they deal with. And then we hold folks accountable by auditing and keeping logs so that we can trace back and ensure that actions have integrity. We follow this up by requirements for secure processing. The Orange Book had specific security feature and assurance requirements. So we knew all this, we defined all this. And then you dive into concepts such as that reference monitor and that trusted computing base. It's not incredibly difficult, right? You can talk that concept through the creation of an operating system or a security vendor product or even the security program development. All we're talking about is authorized access relationships between subjects and objects of the system, right? It sounds a lot like somebody would simplify it as an access list. Somebody would simplify it as the end-to-end spectrum of making sure that what's going on in a network environment is supposed to be going on in a network environment, right? We've heard a lot of talks today about the threats and how we need AI, machine learning, and how we need a whole host of capabilities to solve the unquantifiable threats that we're all facing, when in fact, the threat model can be broken down to three areas, right? Penetration, malicious software, and subversion. Those criteria and the structure added those threats and provided actions and guidance on how to deter them from a system. Now, that's not saying that the threats haven't become more sophisticated, but in a ways, we've overcomplicated the solution, have overcomplicated the problems, which have turned into a flywheel that have overcomplicated what we're trying to solve on a day-in, day-out basis. Why do all of those matter? Again, they focus on trust and persistent access, behavior and intentionality versus capabilities. So we all knew what to focus on. We were taught either through college, through reference manuals as we were learning our ways throughout information security, information assurance, audit. We knew what to focus on decades ago. And so we're going to take some of the concepts identified in that Rainbow Series, which we could probably spend the entire presentation on, and we're going to take a look at some of the security models that tried to build and impart to individuals how to take the concepts in those extremely long white papers, which, by the way, they're a little harsher to read than some of the NIST documentation. So let's take a look, right? I think a lot of us recognize Bella Padula, Biba, and some of the other security modules. We think back to the summer, I think it was in 1972, the MITRE Corporation, which that sounds familiar, right? We're all familiar with the MITRE attack and defend frameworks. They actually initiated a task to produce a report entitled Secure Compute Systems. That modeling task fell to LaPadula and David Bell, and the goal was to stay agnostic, right? So free of system-specific details, identifying and investigating just general principles and addressing specific access solutions that could be incorporated into security programs, both from technology all the way through individual organizations. It's an access control model, right? No read up, no write down, pretty simple. You counter that with focusing on confidentiality and integrity are at odds with each other, right? So that's where Biba comes into play. Think of the Biba security model addressing integrity is characterized as no read down, no write up, right? The summary of that is that Biba takes Bella Padula's rules and reverses them, showing how we all know confidentiality and integrity can sometimes be at odds with one another, but they don't always have to be, which is what led to the development of other advanced models like the Clark-Wilson Chinese wall or Nash model, Graham-Denning, and so forth. Now, unfortunately, in our day-to-days, a lot of our real-world modeling and implementations have been trumped by that grand A and the CIA triangle, right? The availability. The businesses need availability 100%. But by drawing on where these models drew their sources from, Clark-Wilson, Chinese wall, Graham-Denning, these were all real-world models that helped protect integrity by layering in subjects requiring access to objects via programs and so forth. It became more complicated when you had things like a multi-level security system, which we'll talk about here in a second. But all of these models, plus the guidelines from the Rainbow series, they were all designed to protect against persistent, misaligned access to trusted computing resources, applications, and data. So think about that for a second. Everything we've been talking about today, the last few years, months, we knew how to solve this 50 years ago. We're just solving the same problem over and over again with shiny lights, bells, and whistles without focusing on the fundamental issues. So where the heck did things go wrong, right? If we knew the answer, why do we keep making the same mistake over and over again? So multi-level security is the application of a computer system to process information within different sensitivities. Like, so for example, you're storing top secret, secret, and unclassified information on the same system, for example, right? And we want to permit access to all of those at the same time by different users with different security clearances. That's possible, but the challenge being it can be time-conducive and expensive. So systems that implement that multi-level security restrictions sometimes only allow sharing where it doesn't violate those restrictions. Users with lower clearances should be able to access their work with the right permissions, but here's the challenge. Most commercially available software don't attempt to close all these covert channels, which is why we find ourselves in a lot of the patch and pray issues, no matter if we're buying the latest and greatest off-the-shelf software or vendor system that promises to protect against 0 or end days. It's impossible to close all those covert channels. You have to secure the whole system, which businesses and vendors alike do not invest the appropriate resources in doing so because it's impossible to create a 100% secure system. Unfortunately, we've started with this shaky foundation, right? And it takes an enormous amount of effort to resolve some of these issues if we continue doing the same thing over and over. Semi-modern operating systems did a horrible job at this as well, which have also created to the problem, right? Those with the little windows in the name, right, didn't make our lives any easier because they did no effort in large part to close a lot of those covert channels. You then dive into the problem where you have these quantification and qualification challenges. If we're faced with a threat that cannot be fully quantified or qualified, even using our best efforts like the FAIR model, which for those of you that have dived into the factor analysis of information risk models, it was a great first attempt at trying to quantify and qualify some of the information risk, but it's very cumbersome and it can be very challenging for organizations that are not at certain maturity levels to take advantage of that to communicate to the boards. The problem is we've been focusing on security instead of trust. And that has led to a hard work, hot potato, where we're not avoiding the work that's hard, but we're avoiding all of the work that truly pays dividends in the future. So I'd summarize it as the topics up here are probably the biggest culprits to this, right? Security professionals, all of us in here, we haven't demanded anything better, so we now have this robust, confusing, large, and always changing security vendor space that are trying to plug the gaps. We ask for solutions, they provide them, right? But we're asking for the wrong solutions. But instead of a world where we manage risk in a simple manner, we added so much complexity to our processes where we make things worse than they actually need to be. I'm sure all of us have experienced the time where we feel like we can never get ahead, even with the most robust and well-funded security teams and programs, or even the regulations from governments or customers alike that are forcing us to try to get better at this. So now we have an inefficient use of people, process, and technology, the benefit for information security, let alone compliance and privacy, before those were formal disciplines, has been shaky at best. So again, we've stopped doubling down on figuring out how to implement business-aligned security and risk management solutions, which all they do is derive from the works we discussed and would have been a lot of hard work, right? 90% process-oriented, but it's much easier for us to focus on technology to go solve simple problems. We tried to change human behavior through security awareness, and we've seen how effective that's been. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of why we find ourselves in the solution or the scenario today, but it has led to Groundhog Day, right? Not just one Groundhog Day limited to reliving February 2nd, but we find ourselves in this day after day, year after year. Despite the advancements we've made in our ability to prevent, detect, and respond to incidents, it hasn't gotten any better despite the promises made to us by a lot of those out in the solution space. I'm going to throw you your obligatory incident sampling, right? We can point to this all day long and just replace the names, but you see a lot of the commonalities out here. Supply chain, ransomware, no MFA, all these can be tied back to trust and permissions and patching, right? But this doesn't mean the pendulum has to swing in the opposite direction, right? Because we can't eliminate all risk, right? I'm not up here advocating that that's our task. Our job is to manage it to an acceptable level. The only way to eliminate all risk is by shutting the business down, which goes against why we're here in the first place, right? But we shouldn't be stubbing our toes in the very easy, low-hanging fruits. Think about this. We knew this. We know this. We advocate, we preach this. This is how we judge the success and efficacy of our program, is by managing risk to acceptable levels. But we're not communicating it or obtaining the buy-in to strategy in the correct ways. That lack of business translation and agreement from all parties, the transparency and the adequate understanding across the business, that's what keeps us stuck in Groundhog Day. A lot comes back to what we've been chartered to do, what we expect of ourselves, and again, how we define trusted systems, not secured systems. So thinking back to the Rainbow series and the security models, let's focus on why we continue to struggle. Do we all know the difference between trusted and secure? Trusted, at its very basic sense, is sufficient assurance that a product meets design specifications. A trusted system in itself, when you dive in, is one that you have a high degree of assurance in. Okay? That's something tangible. We can get around that. Secure means it cannot be compromised, that it has no vulnerability. Well, how many systems do you know meet that definition, right? Secure systems means not only does it have no vulnerability, but it's a complete system end-to-end that is free from vulnerability. So I challenge that secure systems largely do not exist. They do exist in some highly sensitive areas, right? The US government does a good job of being able to secure certain systems because they're eliminating the access and the ability to manipulate those systems so that you cannot exploit said vulnerabilities. But most systems we assume are secure are actually designated as highly trusted, or trusted to a large degree. We message and aim for perfection. We strive for metrics in an ambiguous environment. And that leaves us struggling if we don't have adequate risk management, risk tolerance, and risk acceptance defined within a business to help guide us. And so we default to what we do, right? We're information security professionals. We're going to go secure our systems. And then when the business has a security incident or breach, leadership is asking, well, how the heck did that happen? If you're information security professionals and you're securing our systems, where's the delta? Nothing is secure, except devices, again, that we talked about that are correctly secured from inception. But we should be focusing on trust. Trust to data, trust to applications, trust to assets, trust to services, and trust among all identities. That is how we escape Groundhog Day. But before we do that, as I'm up here advocating for trust instead of security, our industry continues to move further down the Groundhog Day pattern by trying to advocate for something called a cybersecurity mesh architecture. Some have tried to solve that problem by adding more complexity than required or desired. I mean, look at that. I mean, who wants to sign up to work in an environment that you have to maintain and configure all of those solutions? It looks really cool, right? The technical individual inside me wants to get hands-on and manipulate the outputs that are coming from the whole host of products and making this phenomenal homogeneous system that is going to solve all of our problems, but that doesn't exist, right? We're signing up for a lot of overhead. We're overcomplicating this solution where it hinders us to do more good than bad. Oh, and you see SIM that's stuck up there, right? Remember, gosh, was it 20, 30 years ago? SIM was supposed to be that centralized solution point to all of our problems, right? And so we get into this repetitive cycle of just one more product, one more capability is going to align and automate and solve all of our problems. When at the end of the day, really, 90% of what you need are solid processes, risk management, agreement, visibility, and that's going to tell you what, if any, of these enforcement capabilities you need. I get your mileage will vary depending on what industry you're in, right? Some of us have regulations that require things to be done in a certain way, but that does not eliminate the need of processes, risk management, visibility that lead up to these requirements and technology. I can't restate Bruce Schneier any better than this, right? But technology does not solve your security problems. If you think it does, you don't truly understand the problems and you really don't understand the technology, right? That has held true since Bruce engaged on his mission to help better the information security risk management community, and holds true today. So let's recap. We've been trying to mitigate the threats themselves and the attack surface that we can't define and protect, versus actually protecting the data itself. The data is the one thing that we know and have the ability to go forth and protect. So if the threats are unconstrained, that is, it can't be truly quantified in a way that it's accurate more than the moment you do that initial quantification, a system cannot be threat-proof. Call back to some of our security models. There was this thing called the global property, which I alluded to, right? You have to secure the whole thing. The entire system must be secure for us to say it's secure. Again, a fence is only useful, it goes around the entire side of a property you're trying to protect. That's very similar to us trying to define an attack surface. Think about the solutions that have cropped up over the last few years. We can't define our attack surface, so we're going to go pay somebody else to help go out there and scan, define our attack surface for us, at which point we don't know how valuable that telemetry information is and how to quantify it and make decisions based on it. That's why it is so difficult for information security sometimes to keep pace with the business and vice versa. We've been focusing on the threats and elusive security versus data and trust. So if trust is the root of all of our problems, that means trust itself is the vulnerability that is actually exploited by malicious actors. We use this a lot at Hudl, and I think it's appropriate here as well, that recognizing what got us here will not get us to the next stage in the evolution of our programs. We can end Groundhogs Day, just like Phil Connors, right, in the movie. You know, he escaped when he realized his escape was triggered by a transformation, a core transformation into a different and better person. That's the only time he was able to escape, right? So my challenge to us in this group and what we're going to dive into is that we're no different. We have the strategy, we have the processes, we have the knowledge, but we have to rethink how we're capable of enforcing our strategy. We have to rethink how we're maintaining our security programs and evolve how we engage the business, maintain and improve our programs, and revive our strategies, challenge what we have learned. That way we can get over the rainbow, right? So these two can coexist. They don't have to be stuck in Groundhog's Day. So how do we do this? A complex system is easy to compromise. We talk about today, you've heard a lot of pitches from folks, advanced persistent threats, ransomware, all of artificial intelligence. Gosh, those are overly complicated problems to a very simple, or overcomplicated solutions to a very simple problem. Users, as we all know, will tend to circumvent or bypass complex or time-consuming security controls in the name of efficiency or time savings. They'll push back. They'll kick their feet. They'll get around us one way or another, right? This in turn makes our controls ineffective and we're always playing catch-up. The KISS principle underlies many important tools and practices in information security, right? So a couple of restatements that I'll make for this group before we get to the next slide is that least privilege can be thought of a restatement of the KISS principle as it pertains to assigning rights to users, right? We use least privilege all the time. Least functionality could be a restatement of the KISS principle as it applies to maybe like a server and service provisioning. All about reducing the complexity. Which brings us to zero trust. I will challenge you that zero trust in a lot of ways is just a very simple KISS-inspired representation, restatement of the ideas advocated in the Rainbow series in real-world validated security models. And why is that? It's because it's a cybersecurity strategy. That's all it is. It addresses the shortcomings of all the failed approaches that we struggle time and time again by removing the assumption of trust altogether, okay? You think about that, it's to eliminate the concept of trust from our digital ecosystems. It's really not a best practice that we should be following. It's a strategy that should guide how we mold controls, how we value and secure data. And we know breaches themselves are tied to internal causes, either malicious or accidental, right? So again, that's access to sensitive business and customer data has to be protected by giving us the least amount of access and trust needed to do our jobs. That's not saying we should stop the business, but it's saying we have to rethink how we're trusting systems, not securing systems. We'll get into here a little bit too, how that with a comprehensive approach, it can become a business enabler. Any kind of zero trust strategy that supports architecture, controls, processes, and risk management, it actually simplifies the protection of our data, makes our teams more effective, and helps us better protect our critical assets. It helps us seamlessly and securely deliver business transformation, enables us to support our business's competitive advantage, and makes us a differentiator. It's also designed to be strategically resonant at the highest levels of organization, also supporting finance, right? Taking advantage of things that have the most, I'm going to throw out the term ROI, right, or the return on the investment with a security program and how you're allocating your cycles versus your risk management program. So zero trust in itself is actually upholding the keep it simple principle to the fullest degree. It helps us unite technology and business stakeholders, because the last thing a business stakeholder wants is for information security to say, that's great, submit your request to our portal, take a line, get in our queue, we'll do a review of your design concepts, and then kind of sort of put an SLA on it of when we're going to get back to you, right? It's very difficult to gauge the severity, depth, and breadth of which security teams will need to review new architectures, when if you boil it down to what we'll talk about here in a little bit, this thing called the ProtectSurface, you can define and put action behind things such as data, things such as assets, things such as applications and services and identities, and help enable the business to almost do a microservice-like architecture when they're developing business processes by dragging and dropping and helping work with security to define what those roles look like. As I stand up here and talk about zero trust, it's also, we all know that there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there about zero trust too, right? There's a lot of misnomers about the word. It's been around, it's been highly emotionally charged. It's on a lot of our bingo cards, actually. I bet if you go to some of the conferences around the country too, right? It's been hammered and beaten to death. Zero trust is not about making a system trusted. We've already covered that. It's about to eliminate that concept of trust. One of the ones that I hear time and time again is that zero trust is about identity. Identity is part of zero trust. We all recognize that identity can help enable a borderless work environment, right? Identity is one of those key concepts, but think about that traffic that's being generated by an identity. All of it has to be inspected for malicious content, unauthorized activity, logged and acted upon. So as we get into ProtectSurface and define that later on, you need to extend that across the entire end-to-end transmission stream. And identity is a key component of that, but identity is not the silver bullet to zero trust. This one, we hear over and over again. I hear from a lot of vendors that our tools will provide security leaders and practitioners with the visibility so that you can ... The challenge being most times that visibility is not actionable. So I do need my trusted partners and vendors to give me visibility, that if I don't have it through an efficient process internally, but don't give me something that I can just dump myself into, rework myself. That's not worth the relationship. That has zero value to me, right? That should have zero value to all of us in this room. What does have value is a solution that supports my strategy and journey, that gives me actionable outputs, that makes my life better, that truly understands my business. Zero trust is really not complicated. We're going to start by focusing on the most critical applications and assets. We're going to build a strategy around the 4 design concepts of zero trust. And we're going to dive in that it's not complicated, but it sounds complicated because it forces us to focus on the work that we've put off for so long, right? It requires us to focus our time and attention on the data itself, the classification, tagging, governance of said data, the roles and access rights. Those are the foundational elements that we'll talk about that support a zero trust strategy. And guess what? Those are the things that we should be focusing on now as well. But since we haven't, our problems are more compounded. We also need to call this out. I don't think many of us are making this mistake, but I have come across several organizations that I've consulted for that, they'll pick a framework off of this list here and say, well, that is my strategy. I'm going to go forth and I'm going to go implement NIST CSF, and that's my cybersecurity strategy. Well, that's not a strategy. A framework is not a strategy. When we talk about having a strategy, for an effective practice, a framework is great, but it's an interpretation of your cybersecurity strategy. A framework can be implemented through your controls that are designed through a zero trust strategy and applied throughout the organization. So my call to action for this group is, in order to get started on the road to zero trust, we need to level ourselves up one more to adjust our strategy. If you don't already have something called a grand strategy within your cybersecurity program that aligns to your business initiatives, that is where we need to start focusing ourselves. A couple of samples up here might be prevent data misuse, prevent security breaches, right? These are meant to be bold, right? We're never going to prevent all security breaches, but we need to have a grand strategy that we're pivoting our North Star around. We have to be sick and tired of being sick and tired, and so it's going to force us to reevaluate what a true business-aligned security program looks like. And so once you identify what your grand strategy looks like, you're going to support that grand strategy through a zero trust strategy. We're going to follow the zero trust design concepts we'll outline. You will incorporate your risk management program, which has things such as appetite and tolerance, which give us the metrics for gauging success. Then we are going to focus on our smallest protect surface as possible and expand out, showcase wins. We're going to design a selected frameworks controls through the zero trust lens, and that will allow us to manage and reduce risk versus focus on security. So in information security, right, one of the things we tend to focus on the least is defining what we're trying to protect. We think we know what we're trying to protect, but we don't know where that resides. So over the years, we've been working diligently to reduce our attack surface. But our attack surface is like the universe. It's always expanding. As the business grows, that attack surface always gets bigger. And we never have a good pulse on where that attack surface is. So instead of focusing on that attack surface, we need to focus on the macro level of the attack surface, which in zero trust, pivot from that macro level to the smallest possible reduction of the attack surface, which is called a protect surface. We'll get that here on the next slide. But look at this. We're not talking about any products or solutions up there. You might choose to find a partner, form a relationship with a vendor that allows you to go forth and identify where your assets and your data are, right? To be able to hunt down data internally or in a public cloud, to be able to assist you with enforcing classification and tagging. But this allows you to make more intelligent decisions and be able to refine what that protect surface looks like before you get to that zero trust foundation. All of the things here are designed to arm you with the tools and information necessary to make trust-based decisions, not secure system-based decisions. So when we talk about this protect surface, we're looking at things such as the data, applications, assets, and services. Data. What data needs to be protected, which is why data is at the bottom of our triangle. Applications. Which applications consume certain types of sensitive or classified information? Assets. Which assets are the most sensitive? And services. Which services, like DNS, DHCP, Active Directory, can be exploited to disrupt normal IT operations or availability? So if you think about this, the awesome thing about this protect surface concept is that it's not only orders of magnitude smaller than an overall attack surface, this is always knowable. If you build the right processes and capabilities in an organization to mine and consume and build a knowledge base, this has a higher degree of being accurate than your attack surface. So now you made your attack surface smaller by focusing on the protect surface. You can then go forth and moving controls as close as possible to that protect surface, which we sometimes also interchange and call a micro perimeter, right? Think back, does everybody in here in their organizations perform maybe an annual pen test or a periodic pen test? Show of hands, how many times can a pen tester get inside? Right? Most organizations can't define or protect against your attack surface, which is why a pen tester is always able to get inside, right? Your ProtectSurface is designed to minimize and or shrink the amount of opportunistic and positive attempts that a pen tester or even a malicious adversary gets into your environment by focusing on that trust. And so by creating policy statements that are limited, precise, and understandable, we can limit the ability of our adversary to execute a successful or impactful attack. So I'm up here advocating for, obviously, the perfect theorized application of a ProtectSurface and Zero Trust, but guess what? Since it's just a strategy, we all get to design Zero Trust in a way that molds to our business. Not everybody's going to require us to go forth, take every single ProtectSurface and apply controls to the same degree throughout the environment, which is why it's so business friendly, right? This is why it's tied back to risk management. This is why it's tied back to risk appetite. The design concepts of actually going forth, defining a ProtectSurface and going forth on Zero Trust is really whittled down to 4 areas. Our business outcomes are taking that ProtectSurface and then considering all that we need to know that's critical and identifying and aligning identity with that as well, right? So again, data, applications, assets, and services. Then we're going to design from the inside out. Why are we going to define from the inside out? Because by looking at the data itself, you know who's accessing, manipulating, changing, trying to exfiltrate said data. And then you can follow data from the end-to-end spectrum, right? Both ingress and egress, wherever the data is located. That allows you to make the most accurate and correct policy that's going to apply to said data. The understanding also could come from scanning and mapping those transaction flows. You got to understand how the DAAS, data applications, assets, and services, interact with each other and the resources in your environment or your remote network. Then we have to architect what people call that Zero Trust network, which is a fancy word of saying determine who needs access and what, which is why identities and roles and so forth come into play in the Zero Trust pyramid. Traditionally, we also refer to this as a reference architecture, right? It's a reference architecture for policies and layers, and this might be where you've defined how data needs to flow. You might look for a technology or a capability that can enforce that, but we shouldn't be going forth and looking for a technology to go forth and tell us how workloads should be secure. We define how they're secured and go forth and find the solution that's going to best align. And lastly, it's inspecting and logging and maintaining all traffic, getting into that maturity cycle. Just because you define the ProtectSurface once doesn't mean the business won't evolve and change. All of our businesses are dynamic. So building in a request or a dynamic consumption model that we can make adjustments based on the business. But guess what? Since you defined the ProtectSurface, you've made it very crystal clear what the business needs. How many times is a business unit owner coming to you telling you, yeah, we're going to go migrate everything to Workday or to Salesforce? Well, okay, well, what are you moving there? Everything. What is everything? Well, we're gonna migrate everything to these SaaS systems. We're gonna buy all these modules. We're gonna consolidate and condense 7 or 8 different HRIS or CRM solutions into one. Well, that's great. Do you know where you're getting your data from? Well, yeah. Can you define it? No. That's where ProtectSurface comes into play and allows you to get more granular, right? You can use things like the Kipling method to assist you architecting said policy by asking 5 simple questions: the who, what, how, where, and why. The where and why. The what and how folks are doing it, that can be modified with the where and even why. Who is accessing a resource? What are they using to access it, such as applications? How should they be allowed to access? Then you can establish more granular control. You might trust everything in a certain IP range, but not from different geographies, right? So it's very customizable. Using this Kipling method to create the actual policy, you can hone in on how you configure your security capabilities that you already have within your environment. Other Zero Trust benefits, as we talked about earlier with this ComperSec notion that this term of combining compliance, privacy, and security requirements and expectations on a single individual or a single team that has to do all of them. Zero Trust is actually the best strategy that provides clarity and a path forward to solve the implement once, use many that all of our regulatory requirements and privacy by design requirements are forcing organizations to do. It's also easily extendable for industry-specific regulations And as we've all seen in recent news, right, everything from the federal government and NIST are taking a stab at defining what their version of zero trust looks like. And contractors for the federal government are actually being nudged along this path to better enhance their maturity along a zero trust roadmap and path. Some organizations that are not regulated also might find themselves facing privacy regulations like GDPR, CPRA. Well, guess what? All privacy regulations are telling you to do is be able to identify the right access for the right sources for the right people, again, at the right times, locations, devices, services. That's what zero trust enables you to do through that ProtectSurface. So think about that. We talked about overhauling our strategy, implementing a zero trust strategy, and it makes the world a lot easier because you have one North Star on how you adjust your security program to. So how the heck do we get started with this, right? Because I told you it's not a product. It never will be a product. It's how you think about applying risk management in an organization. What we found to be successful is building this thing called a center of excellence, right? It's much bigger than a team or a cross-functional group. It's dedicated individuals that manage from a common central point throughout the organization. If it's a big enough shift, you might embark on obtaining buy-in from leadership. That's something that I've worked on with my team over the last few months that I've been at Hudl, right? We've obtained executive leadership to craft our security program strategies through the zero trust lens because we've been able to articulate the business agility and the benefits that'll be derived to support sales, to support internal processes, and so forth. But it's only through that dedicated and focused and diverse center of excellence that we're able to get the buy-in, the questions, and create the common knowledge base to move forward. You could also get engaged with a partner, right? There's firms out there or even local industry resources talking with other security leaders or practitioners that have done this before. Ask what worked, ask what didn't work, refine your strategy. And you always want to start low risk versus the crown jewels. So even though we're identifying everything by looking at all of our data, applications, assets, and services, the last thing you want to do is get a black eye when you're starting to clamp down on your zero trust policy. So you always want to start with the low risk first. So in closing thoughts, to make sure we have some time for some questions either here or after the session, the important thing is to remember that slow and steady actually wins this race. You're not going to leave this room, go forth and advocate for zero trust and get it implemented over the next few weeks and months. The first thing that might happen is somebody might just ignore you and tell you, well, that's nice, go forth and solve if you think you can do it, right? Or you might just get blown off. It's not about finding products or capabilities either in an attempt to showcase immediate impacts that wane over time or that can even deliver most of what you buy. But you got to keep your eye on the long prize, right? The long goal line. Adjusting your grand strategy and security strategy takes time to align. It impacts all facets through an organization. And more than anything, believe it or not, it requires excessive listening. Knowing the business better than they know themselves, right? As security professionals, we find ourselves in that position all the time. How many times have you found yourself articulating back to a business or application owner more about the application than they know themselves and they use it every day, right? That's part of what we do day in and day out. We have to also relentlessly pursue the activities that will cause us to win. We might have a program built that can withstand incident after incident. We might be able to showcase to our board and our leadership or even management, yeah, we had 0 successful impacts or breaches last year, but do we have good metrics on how much time and overhead it took to do that? We have to be sick and tired of being sick and tired. Switching the focus to trust versus security sometimes can seem at odds of what we're trying to do. And think about how difficult it is for a non-security person to hear that. I hired a security team and you guys aren't focused on security, you're focusing on this trust thing? That makes no sense. So we have to assume positive intent, lead with empathy, because even if you put together a phenomenal zero trust strategy, people don't know what they don't know, right? So we have to educate, partner, and show why changing tactics is going to better resonate and align with the business. We're not advocating for process elimination. We're refining and changing processes, right? That's what makes zero trust elusive and perceived as difficult because it forces us to reckon with the either both technical debt and or the administrative debt that's within our organization. So once you've defined that why, you have to stick with your why. Remember, zero trust is 80 to 90% behavior, only 10 to 20% head knowledge, just like most things that are worth focusing time on. It's very easy to lose focus You have to remain intentional. You have to seek out advice, and most importantly, surround yourself with like-minded individuals and folks that have either done this before, have explored this before, or are willing to engage with you on an open-ended discussion. So, thank you. He's going to bring a mic around.
I work with an organization that offers a few scholarships each spring. And we have written an essay question. Your talk is very well fit to this. And if I may paraphrase it, it says, when we started this computer business, we thought this was going to be the answer to everything. Now, I go back a ways. I worked with some guys, I had no idea what they were doing, but we were trying to figure out a way to transmit a message from one person to another. Been a while. But we asked, this was going to be our solution to everything from all times. But now we spend half of our effort, half of our resources just to keep the bad guys out. And the question that we ask them to answer is, what went wrong? And if you were developing systems today from scratch, what would we do differently? And we've tried to phrase it, among other things, so they can't copy the answer from Google. And you remember, most of these that are answering this they're high school seniors or maybe the first couple of years of college. So your answer now has been, we give them up to 500 words. You have spoken 40 minutes about it, what we could have done. But it's interesting, and we get some really interesting replies from these people, from these students, and they're competing for scholarship money. So what you have just said here, is very applicable to what we're asking from those students to come back. And I read the answers, and I'm one of those who eventually decides who gets the scholarships. It's an interesting thing we do. We do it here, and it comes out, and it will, you can be, and certainly be in Lincoln and be a candidate. We actually hit most of the states here in the Midwest where they can respond. We don't have a lot of money, but it's an interesting exercise from the students each year.
Thank you.
A great talk. Appreciate all your comments. But the question I would have for you is, we work in a very reactive business, right? And so we can have our strategy and our plan. Here's what we're going to do until whatever the ransomware or Colonial Pipeline or SolarWinds of the day that happens, and the board says, we got to know, are we vulnerable to that? Go do a study, do an assessment, and give us a report on that, right? Mm-hmm. Or the auditors, whatever, come in, the regulators, oh my goodness, fire, we got to solve this regulatory problem, whatever it is. And so it's very reactive. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, how do you keep the board and the executives focused on the strategy, and like you said, starting slow, low risk, work your way out, and establish trust, rather than just always reacting to whatever the fire is of the day?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a good question, because it also goes back to them wanting to know immediate results of the things that you're working on too, right? You have to capitalize on when you have the attention and the funding, but you also want to stay out of the spotlight too, right? Because then your hand gets forced when they see something that they want fixed, right? So I'll give you two answers. One was within an organization that we started pivoting because we already had a program, and then I'll give you some take on what I'm doing now because we really didn't have a formal program when it came on board, so we're really at the ground stage of getting buy-in. At a previous organization, when we were focused on, let's call it the monotonous or list of security controls, focused on delivering the results to a framework maybe, right, and into the risk appetite, we still had to keep our foot on the gas to a lot of those controls, the bare minimum. We had to articulate to leadership and the board that as we're making the pivot to adjusting our strategy, one, they had to understand that it was still aligned with where the business was going. That was number one, and we had to show how that was going to support either revenue growth or customer acquisition, right? But number two was they wanted to see the blended cycles of how we were going to be able to make that pivot and start focusing and adjusting time to those kind of strategies and starting low risk while not taking our eyes off the most mission critical applications and risk, right? So it required us to give up some new capabilities in certain given years and get not really approval, but making sure people were comfortable with the impact that did to the risk tolerance within that organization or the impact to operations, right? A lot of it goes down to the likelihood of what some of those scenarios are going to be like, right? If we do just enough, a lot of us are probably going to be okay, right? You do enough, 90-95% of who's coming either after you opportunistically or targetedly, they're going to give up because they don't want to expel the amount of resources. They're going to go for more low-hanging fruit. Now, at the end of the day, if a nation state's targeting you, you're probably screwed one way or another. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, right? If a nation state's going at you with an insane amount of resources, this strategy actually helps mitigate that impact more than your layered list of controls. So to answer your question, at the previous organization, it was making sure they were comfortable with the resources being devoted from either operations, engineering, or architecture initiatives, while making sure we were keeping the lights on with compliance and regulatory challenges, customer trust and safety challenges and issues, while also making sure we were communicating through the COE and through regular updates the progress you're making on our strategy, right? Because we gave them the option that they could pull the plug at any time if they weren't seeing adequate momentum, if they weren't seeing adequate changes, but we gave ourselves at minimum a 12-month runway to start showing some progress, right? Because we know you're going to have to go talk to a lot of people, right? When they ask, well, how are you going to go out and define this ProtectSurface? And when you're talking to leadership like that, I said, we're going to go forth and we're going to validate and help refine the asset inventory. And they said, well, we already have a CMDB. We already have all these things in place. You don't have everything in your CMDB, right? And that's the whole point. It took a lot of convincing that we were spending the cycles in the right aligned manner, right? That it went with a lot of risk discussions, a lot of cycle discussions, a lot of budget impact discussions, and the willingness to allow them to be stakeholders in the process and pull the plug and or change direction, right? So that's how we were able to kind of funnel those both in, knowing that you're also at the mercy of whether that revenue is going to be unlocked and given to you for your budget. Now, starting from scratch, it's a lot easier because in my current organization, there are pieces of security in play throughout the organization. They didn't ignore security, but I had the opportunity to come in and help build the program, and we were able to solicit board and executive buy-in to design the program from the ground up. And so we're pulling folks along. Folks are excited. It's a much easier conversation than things that are in place, but it's possible and doable, but it's all tailored to what's the comfort level and knowledge level of the exec team, your peers, and so forth. And you got to get evangelists at all levels, right? It probably took us 12 to 18 months before we proposed that, making sure folks were comfortable with it, having conversations, taking somebody out for a cup of coffee when that was still allowed, right? So hope that helps. I'm happy to dive into more, deeper outside of the room here. But yeah, there's no one silver bullet on how to go forth and do that. It's all about what you will defer in order to focus on the things that'll move the needle long term.
Hey, Robert. Mike Wellna. Great talk. Very relevant, very appropriate. Thanks for giving it. My question is, what's your method, or I guess maybe the right word would be like mindset, when you're trying to define your protect surface out of your attack surface, when the default or your gut instinct is all of it, right? I mean, that's your first thing is like, well, I got to do every endpoint, every server. I gotta all the different segments of my network. I got a data vault here, but the data moves around from here to there. I also got to do cloud. So the gut response is all of it, right? And so what's the mindset or the methodology to really carve it down, like you said, and get it to that minimized representation of your attack surface to what you want to protect versus what you don't? And is that the right way to look at it? Like, these are the things that I care about the most, so that's where I'm going to focus my efforts. And then what? I don't care about the other stuff? I mean, that doesn't feel right, you know? So how do you kind of, how do you approach that?
Yeah, good question. Very good question. How we have started and what I found to be successful is starting with the most critical down to the least critical business processes, right? The things that both we know and we kind of sort of have a hunch because we're seeing stuff go on of how folks are supporting their business operations, and defining all of the data, applications, assets, and services along that end-to-end spectrum, right? So to your point, at some point we want to protect all of it. We want to have visibility and controls amongst everything, but we start by looking at manipulation with the data and the application and where that's all being touched and where that's all flowing out from. Defining where that is, that gives us a good enough rough guesstimate of how to start aligning the zero trust controls. And we don't start with the most critical, right? Because those can, like you said, it can touch multi-cloud, it can touch SaaS, it can touch vendors, it can touch, so we start with some things that might be more internal to our network. For example, some of the finance processes that are internal, reconciliation, even some CRM processes that are internal at our organization, defining what that ProtectSurface is, knowing where the data could, obviously where the data lives, but where it could be manipulated, stored, and accessed from. That allows us to start. And so you might be biting off, wow, that means I have to secure endpoint, that means I have to secure, or I means I have to protect secure connectivity across untrusted networks. That also means that I need to do X, Y, and Z. That's where some of those requirements can stem from. And if you look at your entire applications list or business process list, you'll start identifying commonalities of, well, hey, if I do that here, that's already setting me up to go partial way on some of the, that's how we've worked our methodology. And as you start working your way up the stack, and as you remember, back to my pyramid, we didn't start our zero trust foundation until we had some of that other, maybe like an MVP level of our data, knowing where it is, how it was classified and tagged. That also allows you, once you start enforcing those policies, people start complaining pretty quick if they're doing something that's not sanctioned, or if they're not doing something that was articulated to you and your team when you're going forth and trying to pivot your strategy. So that allows you to make the considerations to your journey on, well, is that valid? If it is valid, why is it not following this process? Because those things will come to light throughout the entire process. People are using, I'm going to use another buzzword, right? They're using their shadow IT, or they're using other things that we have no idea about, and you don't know that unless you either ask somebody the right pointed questions, which that's almost near impossible to do all the time, or you start slowly clamping down and along your way to your risk methodology and your risk tolerance levels, and then start coming to light. So hopefully that helps. But yeah, we defined it all. We had a good enough structure, and we started off low risk, going up, because in security, you stop the business from doing enough, people are going to scream loud enough that you lose a lot of that momentum and goodwill.
So just a follow-up question for you. So you talked about measuring things and to show success. So, thinking of Google OKRs and measure what matters. What do you measure? So as your center of excellence, you're saying, we're doing this. What are you showing us? This is what we measure to show we're being successful and that we're making progress.
That's another very good question. In order to show success, you have to have metrics to begin with, right? So a lot of organizations may not have reliable or agreed upon metrics to start. So that makes the conversation even more difficult. What are you going forth and solving if you don't have any benchmark to protect against? So the answer to your question is in two answers, right? The ones that don't have good metrics, that aren't articulating or don't have a buy-in on what you should be tracking, we make hypotheses that are rough guesstimates based on what we do know in our risk register, what we do know within our classification and sensitivity list, that we do have quantification and some rough agreement on what the qualification is, right? And then we make a measured target on what we're striving for, knowing that we're going to refine that target that we're looking. We know if we're going to implement, zero trust strategy to this degree across this ProtectSurface, and we know that business process, the business can tolerate, I don't know, 30%, right, risk impact on whatever the asset value is. We can try to start tracking and building that, right? That's how we've approached things. So at Hudl, there really wasn't defined risk tolerance and appetite throughout the entire organization, right? You wouldn't have to, right? As organizations scale, that starts to be developed. And so we're developing rough guesstimates based on asset criticality, the tagging, and showing them targets of, through the zero trust methodology, this is what we think we can deliver as far as how fast we're able to respond to an incident, right? So people might use MTTI, MTTD, MTTR sometimes. We show deviations to that through the zero trust lens versus in the day in the life of a traditional security stack or security program. Back at the other organizations where this has been successful at, if you take those existing metrics, you're able to make more intelligent guesstimates of the efficiencies you're able to derive from that. So again, mean time to identify, detect, respond, you're able to show improvements upon when a new business process or a new initiative is spin up, the amount of time it takes security to bless reference architecture, spin up rules, right? If you already have micro to protect services defined and you have a new application that uses 90% of that, reusing and tweaking part of that to reapply and open up either rules or communication amongst trust for users takes a lot less time than having to, okay, well, what port do you need? Is it communicating over non-standard ports? And, you know, all that stuff that goes into sometimes opening up just the right pinholes in environments, whether it's cloud or on-prem. You can simplify that by reusing a lot of the ProtectSurface areas and being able to showcase the reduction in the improvement in agility, reduction in time that security takes with certain processes. And we've measured that so forth even down to, you know, risk management and the ability, the time and cycles it takes to support PCI compliance or process like a DSAR for privacy, for example, too, right? So all of those things have different impacts, either top line or bottom line to revenue and operating activity, and that's what we try to measure against.
We're out of time.
Okay.